Okay, I think we can start with the last thematic panel, which is Civil Society Citizens in Struggle for Democracy. My name is Nenad Markovic. I'm a professor at the Political Science Department of the Law Faculty Justinianus Primus in Skopje, North Macedonia. And I'm very happy to be the last panel chair, with the note that I will be one of those panel chairs that will give warnings in 5 and 1 minute until the end of the presentation, which nobody likes and somebody has to do. So basically, please stick to the time. I think 15 minutes is okay, with the possibility to extend a little bit, because obviously Juliana Aidini and Erika Bejko are missing from the panel, the two ladies that should have presented a case study on the Kukës region in Albania. So we have only 3 panelists today. First is Sergio Barbosa. Can digital deliberation take place on WhatsApp? With the University of Coimbra, if I'm informed right.
Yes.
Then it's our own Biljana Đorđević from the Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade. Is it? I think there is a mistake in that, because it's a question. Is it through representation that collective political subjects are created? It said it is through representation. So, is it through representation that collective political subjects are created? Dilemmas of participation and representation in political activism. And last but not least, Mohsen Abasadeh Mazbali, Democratic Theory After the Populist Challenge, the Dilemma of Popular Sovereignty. Our colleague comes from the University of Mazandaran in Iran, if I pronounce that rightly.
Yes.
I hope so. Okay, without further ado, the titles are chosen perfectly in terms of being connected one to the other and to the general topic of the conference. So I would give the floor to Sergio Barbosa with his topic: Can digital deliberation take place on WhatsApp? WhatsApp is an application that many things are taking place at. So let's see if digital deliberation can take place. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. It's okay to speak? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say thanks to the organizers, mainly to the CIDOMI, to organize everything very well. And yeah, so currently I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Coimbra, linked to the CES, the Center for Social Studies, and also the Faculty of Economics. And currently I'm based in Germany, in Bochum, at a research at an institute called KAIS, the Center for Advanced Internet Studies. So what I'm going to present today is one of the articles that is a spin-off of my PhD research, and then I will talk briefly a little bit. Oh. Yeah. So in the last 5 years of my academic career, I have been investigating WhatsApp activism in Brazil. Basically, from this research, I focus mainly on digital sociology and digital activism field. And everything started when I was conducted my master in political sociology at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in the south of Brazil. And from there, I moved to Coimbra to start my PhD, and then try to ameliorate the definition of the so-called WhatsAppers, that is the activists that appropriate WhatsApp to foster social change. And then the outline of the paper that I'm presenting here in this conference, it's trying to reflect about if the deliberation can take place on WhatsApp. And then I talk a little bit in the paper about the importance to situate the case study in the Global South framework, and what would be the definition of what I name WhatsAppers. And I reflect a little bit the methods of conducting qualitative research on and with private chat apps. And then I discussion the results and a little bit of what would be a conclusion. So the justification and goals, basically, it's despite of the huge numbers of Brazilian scholars dedicated to investigate everyday digital life of far-right activism, little research, however, has focused on a study case of how leftist activists combine action repertoires on online and offline arenas. So in some way, my research looks at pro-democracy movements in Brazil, instead of the WhatsApp scholarship right now, looking at how disinformation, misinformation also can take place on WhatsApp. So with this paper, I have two research questions. mainly these two, that can deliberation take place on WhatsApp, and in which ways UCG members, that the activists of the group that I conducted research, forced digital deliberation during the COVID pandemic in Brazil. And then I will go into some reflections. So these I made like a question: are the chat apps the game changers of 2020s? So in some way, we have a massive use of chat apps worldwide, and being also competitive in each of them, and attract different kind of users all over the planet. Of course, my case focus on WhatsApp, but we look also at the European case, you have a huge penetration of Signal, and also in some countries like Russia and Iran, you have a mass penetration of Telegram. And then if you look from all of these back years, also the quantity of WhatsApp messages sent by WhatsApp in a minute increased a lot. So if you look at the 2018, it's 38 million. And then 2019 also combined with the WhatsApp, with the messages of the Facebook, 4.56, and then the last one is 59 million. And then I try to situate the case of Brazil and why we have a WhatsApp activism in one of the largest social democracies of the global south. So Brazilians nickname WhatsApp as Zap Zap in Brazil. And usually we use the platform as a one-stop solution and a problem solver. Unfortunately, we have the so-called zero rating fees that in a sense it's a predatory fees that telecom companies offers WhatsApp unlimited. So basically Brazilians use it also to call through WhatsApp instead of the normal plan of the telecom company. In some way, this causes a huge dependence on WhatsApp platform all over the 26 states plus the federal district. And then we have a little bit of these relations of the public and private blurred on WhatsApp, as the public discussion also become these hot topics on these group interactions. And they intimate because if you look at the private chat apps, you have administrators controlling the gates on who can be part or not. So it's an intimate arena, and how you can also discuss backstage activism. These groups also reveals a kind of interpersonal trust. It depends on who sent your message and if you trust or not in this message. And in the case of the Brazil, the low levels of digital literacy also cause a lot of troubles, mainly when we look at the misinformation, disinformation campaign, mainly during our last election, 2018. And then we also have some violence and criminal attacks in other countries all over the planet, mainly with the Pegasus technology of Israel. So this is my case study. The name of the group, we call in Portuguese Unidos contra o Golpe, that with English translation will be United Against the Coup. So it's a long-lived group on WhatsApp, playing on the group since 2016. So the group was created on 30th of March by a political active member from Florianópolis, the capital city of the state of Santa Catarina, where I did my master in political sociology. So group of members in the beginning demanded Rousseff's return to the presidential cabinet. UCG is basically a pro-democracy heterogeneous group, including professional journalists and students, with minority members from other parts of the country, and also diaspora all over Brazil and foreign citizens. They position themselves as defenders of progressive values, promoting equality and social change, mainly at the local level. The group includes both experienced activists as 3J trade units and new bias to active politics. It hosts content of political content, news, image, links, and memes and videos, social protests and reflection on the political situation. At the time of writing, UCG is still active, a long-term group aging 6-year-olds of social and political interactions on WhatsApp, although with a declining membership. We have 121 members in 2022. So basically, what I'm naming as WhatsAppers is these activists who make intense use of WhatsApp, appropriating it also for participation in political daily life. WhatsAppers are able to accrue personal, family, work, and political functions. The app plays as a generator of political identity, also promotes an instantaneous approach to mobilization and its resource, and appropriating WhatsApp allows residents groups to bypass the setup of traditional organization infrastructure. Contribute also to a distributed approach to leadership and decision making, and it promotes a sense of collective identity and trust among participants, helping to forge variable, strong ties between individuals, regardless of geographical location, if we look at the Brazilian map. So with my research, also during my time in Germany, I'm writing an article about how it's possible to triangulate qualitative methods to investigate WhatsAppers. Here in this paper, I'm just looking at one of the methodology that the digital ethnograph with the goal to do a long zoom on perspective on social interactions in the chat group from March to July 2020. So the goal is to reveal the subjective motivations related to the why and how social actors participate in the behind of the scenes of chat-based activism, and how it's investigate UCG modus operandi and identity formation at the group level, and also investigate individual mobilization values and expectation construction of the meaning with the micro level. So with this micro level, I combine with face-to-face semi-structured interviews, but with this article, I'm not presenting the data of the interviews. And then we have the COVID pandemic in Brazil, that we have a very bad administration from the point of the presidential cabinet led by Jair Bolsonaro. And then with this article, I try to understand how they moved all of their the group discussion to the online arena of WhatsApp, and how these the content of the chat exchange messages can also be deliberative. And then the core thematics during this from March to July of 2020 that I selected here is the information of health literacy, citizen agents, hyperlocal initiative to promote care, and also small arenas to combat COVID-19 related disinformation. Because also they receive a lot of disinformation from other groups, so they try to discuss also, again, also inform and discuss with neighbors. For example, we have Bolsonaro suggesting hydroxychloroquine as a real medicine effective against corona, and then they receive a lot of messages like this, and then they try to also convince and also react to this kind of the messages with other WhatsApp groups of local communities. And then I released also a policy brief for a Swedish institute, and how recommending some recommendations from the local government, how they can also in some way interact with these WhatsApp groups of the local communities in the city of Florianopolis. And how we can things about disseminate of accurate information, spread popular message, adapt to local context, because sometimes these scientific messages were not in some way pedagogical and make sense for the context they receive the messages. And also how can they promote a creative collaboration between these local activism and also being suppliers from the part of the local municipality. And then my conclusions in these articles is these emerging forms of how participation promotes action repertoires, both in the technological sides as well as on the ground. The deliberative content matters on WhatsApp. Maybe I cannot talk about digital deliberation, but I can talk about the deliberative content of the WhatsApp chats exchange inside the group, and how this was important, for example, to group members solve urgent needs to confront the COVID pandemic in Brazil. And sometimes also presents a new generation of activists play on WhatsApp, but also grounded on networks of solidarity during COVID pandemic. And then I'm just finished, I'm just still writing the methodological article at KAIS in Germany. And that's it. I finished my presentation.
Thank you. This was 15 minutes to the point, exactly 15 minutes, without any warnings, without any, without going over the time limit. I personally find this very interesting because since the Russian-Ukrainian conflict started, I figured out that these kind of applications are very important for communication and for deliberative space, both positive and negative, I must say. Especially, I think there is a little war going on lately when the invasion started on Telegram, for instance, which is a very active app in this regard. And this just tells me that this kind of problematic and this kind of deliberative spaces are not to be excluded from academic interest. On the contrary, they are very, very important for the overall picture. Okay, next is Biljana Đorđević. So I didn't figure out the title. Is there an inversion of words, because there is one question mark?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a quotation, so it is in quotation. There is a dot, but I put a question mark. So, but your point taken. So I'll dive much into.
It's just
participation and representation. That's
it's just
this one. Yeah. This one, but where is the point?
Where is the pointer? There it is. Okay. Please take over.
You don't need it that much. Okay. At the beginning, I have a confession to make. I will have a presentation based on a research conducted quite some time ago, some 3 years ago, that I never published. It was just the first draft, and I had some issues with and you'll soon realize with methodology and some questions about how to disentangle several goals that I had. I actually intended to do just some of it for this presentation. Unfortunately, did not succeed in this, so I will combine reading some aspects from the paper and giving some comments. So it is about. It started as an attempt to basically think about some changes that happen from bottom-up citizen mobilization in the Western Balkans, in particular in Serbia, and at the same time de-democratization, so the normalization of authoritarianism. And the context is that there are several processes that are happening, and all are relevant for some broader issues that I want to raise. And the first is unquestionable democratic delegitimization of the elections, especially in the period of transition to liberal democracy, fetishized as the core element of democracy, and especially in Serbia since 2012. My view was that, and is still, elections have been gradually subverted into a technique abused by the ruling party and its leader in order to shrink effective political pluralism. So the first is elections, the legitimization of elections. The second is continuous process of delegitimization of political parties as unsuccessful mediators between various social classes, economic interests, and political conflicts on one hand, and the state on the other hand. And so it also meant basically destruction of the party system in Serbia, but at the same time we do have some strong parties, the party that is almost identified with the state, and citizens do not see parties as these mediators of different interests, but basically either as a national employment agency or a protection racket. And the third process is actually the topic of the paper. This is the context that, that actually, as a consequence, had basically intensification of the role of an activist citizen as the non-elected representative. So here where representation comes in, the story of activist participation, that in the theory of representation, especially in this new constructivist turn of political representation, there is more and more discussion about this, that representation should not be equated just with elections, but that there actually, it should be understood as a dynamic process of making representative claims. And therefore, many people who are not elected also make different representative claims. So I actually wanted to do this research about activists as representatives, so as non-elected representatives. I realized that especially when I talk about this in Serbian, it's complicated because people don't understand, even the activists that I interviewed don't think of themselves as representatives. They think of themselves as activists, and representatives, this is equated with the traditional meaning, you know, elected representatives. So in a way, there are other terms that authors use, informal representatives or self-selected representatives, etc. Because of this distinction in the importance of the election, I prefer, especially in English, to stick to this non-elected representatives, which does not mean that these people, you know, were not elected when they stood or participated in elections, but that actually, regardless of their participation at elections, they do represent, regardless of what they think about this. Also, the context was that in the past 6-7 years, there has been numerous protest movements emerged, and the first one, and that the paper mostly focused on, the biggest one and the first one since early 2000s is Don't Let Belgrade Run, and then there was a protest movement against dictatorship, then one of the 5 million. And finally, environmental protest, most famous in the context of environmental blockades. But all of them, regardless of different reasons and ideologies, all of them, in my view, were a reaction to authoritarian decision-making processes and not democratic character of elections, because most of them were tied with, contingently at least, with elections, that they happen after the elections or something like that. And the mistrust in the political elites and the degenerated representative system. So my initial aim was to analyze this new understanding of political representation among activists of different civic initiatives and social movements, to understand better this idea and concept of non-elected representatives. In this particular paper, I focused on Don't Let Belgrade Run, but I did other interviews with other activists. So what I want to say is that this is part of some broader research that I'm not really sure in what direction will go. So be gentle to me and maybe give me some advice, what ideas you have for me at the end. So in this particular presentation, I focus. So my hypothesis is that activists become more and more representatives that aim to articulate fellow citizens' unfulfilled demands, but also to re-articulate fresh meanings of public goods, citizenship, activism, democracy, and representation. And the notion of representation that I focus on mostly with this constitutive function to constitute those that they are represented is theorized by Ernesto Laclau, and this I compare with activists' ideas of political representation, how they themselves, in interviews or statements, claims, understood representation. So initially, as I said, I wanted to elaborate this dilemma between individual activism that are usually, when people discuss their own activism and their own identification as activism, initially, they usually have this uncompromising loyalty to particular political values. But in this paper, I also want to focus on collective trajectory of how not just individual activists change their identity, but also how collective activism, how something that was a civic initiative transformed into a social movement and to transform into political movement, basically informal political party. It's not legally party, but it has how to say, organization that looks like almost like a movement party. So some of the dilemmas were in this line between this transformation from I to we, from horizontal to vertical, non-representation, and then representation. But these are not coherently structured in this paper. But these were the dilemmas that I had when I sent an abstract. So why I use Laclau? Just also something briefly about the sources that I used. So The first one were the produced materials of Don't Let Belgrade Drown. The second one were the interviews conducted with core members in 2019, in summer 2019. That was the period before, it was the period after Don't Let Belgrade Drown participated in the first elections, where they didn't enter the local parliament of Belgrade, but were not yet, did not yet start the process of building an organization. So it was before that, so this is the focus. And the third is my participant observation. Now, here is the complication. At that time, when I started writing this and interviewed people within the movement, I was a sympathizer of the movement. I actually stood as a candidate for the citizen list, but I was not really that involved. So I had this some kind of distance, although I'm not claiming any objectivity. I don't believe in objectivity in this type of research, or that is needed. It was clearly intention that the research should also be political intervention. But since 2019, I actually become much more involved in the movement. So just for the sake of clarity, I'm discussing the period before. I might make some comments about periods afterwards. Now, why Laclau? There are two reasons. One is that Laclau's conception of populism, it's usually interpreted as left populism, hegemony and representation, was influential in analyzing square and protest movements that turned into institutional politics. So there were papers about Spain, Slovenia, even Turkey using Laclau. The second is that I think it's interesting to compare Laclau's theory of populism with a philosophy of municipalism, precisely because, I mean, this was also done in Spain with Podemos and Barcelona and Comú, and in terms of Don't Let Belgrade Drown, the movement identified itself with municipalism as a local municipalist movement. But even at that time, I thought that in particularly in the context of a hybrid regime that Serbia is, basically the future of such activism will have to be positioned between the pluralist politics of multiplying the fronts of struggle, that it's municipalism, and on the other hand, engaging in operation that is intrinsically reductive and hegemonic, which is how populism is described. So this is why I'm using this. And also Laclau is something that, I mean, he's a theorist that is not directly linked with this constructivist turn in political representation, but he wrote before that, and his chapter on representation in Unpopulist Reason is basically predates, you know, this constructivist turn. So now there are some authors who emphasize this. And basically, move also, that's where the title goes. I'll now try to explain this. She worked also with Laclau and taken over a lot of these views in her pamphlet on left populism. She contends that the problem concerns the way representative institutions function at the moment, when so many voices are excluded from representation. What needs to be challenged is the lack of alternatives offered to citizens, not the very idea of representation. It is through representation that collective political subjects are created, and they do not exist beforehand. So this is this constitutive function of representation, that actually there is awareness that even, not just this selected representation that is criticized by the movement, including Don't Let Belgrade Drown, but also just the concept of representation that we cannot escape in politics. We can give it a different name, you know, we can resignify it if we want to escape the concept of representation, but it's always there because we always speak on behalf of someone, and it's always, Mouffe would say, we will never be without exclusion, but it is still needed for subjects to become subjects. So in that sense, this is how I want to basically think of connection of participation and representation, and maybe return dignity to the idea of representation. So representation has this performative dimension to construct, in Laclau's term, a people that will be impossible without the operation of mechanism of representation. In terms of my particular case, Don't Let Belgrade Drown, my argument, my claim was that basically the main representative, but also at the same time this empty signifier to connect various social demands in the beginning, when this was more a movement and identified itself as a horizontalist movement, regardless of what I think about horizontalism as such. The main representative was actually a symbol, not a particular person. And that is the symbol of duck. To explain for people who are not from the region and do not know this, because for us it's probably really boring, but Don't Let Belgrade Drown opposed to particular infrastructural project, Belgrade Waterfront. And this was a particular case. It could be seen as a special, single issue protest movement, but this was also a metaphor for various other things: lack of democracy in making planning decisions, expropriation of public property in the name of private property, but with justification that it's in the national interest, etc. All these various protests were at one point combined, and they were visibly perceived by audience through this mascot, a giant yellow rubber duck that has become the symbol of the movement. And in my view, it worked up till the point as this empty signifier that would connect various struggles, including environmentalists, cyclists, LGBT population, feminist groups, all united against the Belgrade Waterfront project. So that meant, in Serbian as a jargon, it was meant to be a sign of a fraud, because some people thought that the project will never happen. Unfortunately, we can see that it did happen. But also a fraud that everything, the entire process of making decisions, that officially it has public debates, it has some democracy elections, that is a fake, it's a fraud. So on one hand, this is the symbol of a fraud. But I also wanted to say that it worked in a way to, in Laclau's term, as something that connects the work as a chain of equivalence among this plurality of unfulfilled different social demands. That you don't see initially directly linked to the Belgrade Waterfront, but people could, through this idea of joint resistance, connect these various issues. And this was this constructions that basically required some positive symbolic expression, something that is denied by power to enter the field of representation. So it happened through the duck. So the duck went everywhere where there were frauds afterwards, not just Belgrade Waterfront, in front of the parliament, in front of the different crime scenes. So it had this role. And also, it was used in various, merchandise, T-shirts that activists would wear, etc. But also like some kind of a change of, images of official signs. So this is the official Belgrade coat of arms, and this was the, Don't Let Belgrade Drown variation of the Belgrade coat of arms with the duck. The duck is the main Belgrader, but also resisting, the symbol representative of resisting citizens. So the opposition to the project was at the same time, as I said, single issue struggle, but also resistance to what is essentially a metaphor for lack of citizen sovereignty, formally proclaimed in the Constitution and a symbol of their dispossession from the public property in the name, as I said, private profit. Can a yellow duck be an empty signifier and connect resistance to destruction of the city and all the things public and awakening citizens from the post-socialist transition hypnosis? My argument was that it worked up to a point, but so the duck grew in size as the lies multiplied, and it represented the signs of resistance to different frauds. But also it became a symbol of pasty and persistent, though never aggressive citizens saying "kwa kwa" to all the lies. The main slogan of the protest has been "Whose city, our city," so it emphasizes common ownership of the city, but there were also variations used, especially in this electoral campaign, of visuals of Belgrade as Patkov grad, city of the duck, so pointing out that the ownership is of those who are resistant activist citizens, but also Duckmobile, Patkomobil, a car refurbished to look like a duck that cruised around the city, around spaces of frauds and crime, which citizens embraced immediately. Symbol is inclusive and mobilizing, or at least it looked like this. It also, you could say that it's somewhat universal because duck has been used throughout the world, in Russia, Brazil, and different protest spaces. But who can be represented by the duck when you enter electoral phase? So I think that it worked up to the point, it constructing the constituency of Patkari, citizens of the duck, I don't know how to explain, who claim that as active citizens, they should be authority and they should determine and keep fighting for the things that they are theirs. But in terms of this combination of participation and representation, once you are affected by these institutional constraints and going to elections, you know, it can work up till the point, and it changed afterwards. That's why I'm focusing on this period, because afterwards we don't really see a duck as a representative. He did not have any role in this particular election campaign. I'll end with this photo of the results of 2018 as an evidence of my claim that duck was a representative, because you can see that all the faces of leaders, all male, of the list that participated in the election and just Don't Let Belgrade Drown has a duck. It doesn't have a face. Of course, it doesn't mean that all of them use this, but, you know, somebody else beside me also saw a duck as a representative. I suppose I used all my time because I'm very slow. There are so many other things that I could say, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'm satisfied that that was better than Shishi. So, by a significant margin. I always like this type of presentations that go into participatory democracy, or in the area of participatory democracy, and one of the first things you said that was overstressing of procedural democracy, which always makes me panic. We went through that experience in my country, so basically I always tend to favor associative and participatory forms being researched and being presented in this way. I think that I didn't interrupt you because the duck story was so interesting. I really loved it. We have the last presentation, after which we can engage into a small debate, because, as I said, Ms. Aydini and Beyko are not here, so we are moving to Mohsen Abazadeh Marzbali, Democratic Theory After the Populist Challenge, the dilemma of popular sovereignty, something that I'm very interested in because I do teach political theory, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So please take the floor. I will leave you the same time as for the other panelists, which is more than 15 minutes, okay?
Thank you so much for inviting me and doing everything prestigiously in this conference. My presentation is about how we can learn from populism for democracy deepening and democracy promotion, depending on the context. So the most important things here is the meaning of popular sovereignty or people-based sovereignty. And I want to learn something from Western experiences in theory and practice and apply it on the Middle Eastern society, a typical Middle Eastern society, for example, Iran, Egypt, Afghanistan, every society which we can see there a deep presence of religion, or I can name a religion-affected society. So The rise of contemporary populist movements has challenged democracies while highlighting their dilemma theoretically. I mean, while populism refers to inadequate inclusion in democracies, depending on the discourse of the populist movement, for example, left or right. Populism itself leads to the retrieval of politics of exclusion due to polarization of the society. I believe that democratic theory has potential to deal with this paradoxical dilemma. The dilemma is interconnected with the ambiguity of popular sovereignty because the people is an empty signifier which can be filled out with any ideology. I mean, populism is a form in the sense of law and move, and its contents can be extracted from the ideologies that host the populism. So, I believe that being open to alternative articulation of the people and popular sovereignty makes democratic theory updated and more participatory. Of course, provided that the alternatives show commitment to the democratic, I mean identify themselves with democratic. So it can make democratic theory more progressive because it can absorb some contextual supplements to our perception of democracy. I believe that this modification has implication for two contexts, both in Western societies and Middle Eastern societies. In Western societies, the matter is democracy deepening, I think, because you can see there a long-standing experience of democracy. But in Middle Eastern societies which are in transition to democracy, the matter is democracy promotion, or trying or struggling for building initial structures of democracy. So, I believe that democratic theory can provide us with some theoretical instrument to overcome this challenge. And in this process, I think we can use the opposing or competing democratic theories under a combinative framework to reconceptualize democracy in concomitant with context and intentions. So, two sides of these combinative frameworks are competing theories. On the one side, radical democratic vision of the rule of affect or passion in the formation of political subjectivity is important because it insists on the importance of forms of life in people's orientation about democratic order, democratic structures, and they should see their values, they should see their cultural beliefs in democratic articulation of, for example, constitutional law of the country. And here, populism is relevant because populism, in the sense of like law and move, can make a collective subjectivity or a general will extracted from people's passion-based orientation to politics. But on the other hand, I think we need deliberative tradition of democratic theory because we need some pragmatic foundationalism it is because we want to make a consensus among the multiple demands prevailing over the society. So without any foundation, we cannot reach such a aim. Under deliberative democratic tradition, I want to emphasize on its late development. I mean, as Habermas said, a political foundation of solidarity, for example, cultural heritage, more especially religious ones, in making people committed to democratic order, and the relevance of post-essentialist conception of democracy, as we can see, for example, in John Rawls' book named Laws of People, and its emphasis on post-metaphysical version of democratic belonging, and other elements of this tradition can be counted as Habermas says, a post-secular scheme which can make democratic theory more progressive. Using this combinative theoretical framework, I want to start with the impact of populist mobilization on democratic deepening. The key factor here is collective subjectivity. As an emotional discourse, populism constructs collective subjectivity to reconfigure populism. Considering this, the radical democratic approach frames populism as a potentiality for deepening democracy, not a threat to democracy. Because populism can make a general will to change the political agenda in favor of ordinary people, or demos. However, given the contending phases of populism determined by the host ideology, for example, the authoritarian ideology or democratic one, populism has ambivalent implications for democracy, pro-democracy or against democracy. Pro-democracy implications depends on making a social imagination that articulates multiple wills around a general demand for a more popular or inclusive governance in democracies. I mean, changing the status quo. However, such an optimistic assessment of the role of populism in the retrieval of democracy is based on a presupposition, that is, general consensus on the democracy as an ideal. So, learning from these attitudes towards populism, I want to change or switch on the matter of democratization in Middle Eastern societies. So here the key factor or the important things is how we can make a hegemonic bloc towards democratization of the regime. So it needs replacing the stereotypical binary opposites. So the genre-based nature of populism might play a double-edged role in transition to democracy in such a society. On the one hand, it may lead to populist regime with the authoritarian features. For example, anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism, anti-pluralism, demagogy, etc. But on the other hand, it may lead to a counter-despotism populist movement comprised of pro-democracy forces, whether religious one or secular one. However, it emanates from the presupposition that compatibility of being religious and being pro-democrat. So it is built on a presupposition in a deep layer, that is, Islam as a religion can be adopted to be compatible with democracy. I mean, there are some principles in Islam which can be compatible with democracy. For example, liberty, inequality, tolerance about other cultures, and woman dignity, etc. So, if take this compatibility for granted, so the stereotypical binary opposites of the debate on democratization in Middle East should be changed. I mean, we should switch the secular against religious on to the democrat against authoritarian, no matter religious or secular. So, such modification can highlight democracy as a popular demand, whether from a secular or a religious perspective, and makes religious commitment overlap with democratic norms. I mean, makes religious belief in some values which can pave the way for democratic norms or prevail democratic norms over the society. However, a more fundamental problem remains to be more clarified. So, if democracy promotion needs a democratic hegemonic bloc against the despotist regime, the democratic consolidation after the hegemony needs a contextual social contract. As mentioned earlier, the positive impact of populism on democracy is built on a presupposed consensus on democratic order, institutions of liberal democracy, as Laclau Move see their project as radicalization of liberal democracy, not moving beyond democracy. So here, similar consensus is needed, but we need here a pragmatic foundationalism which can pave the way for this aim. I mean, a post-secular scheme of democracy which can provide us with the possibility to contain both the rational and religious justification of democracy. Such a scheme, such a combinative scheme has two sides. First, deconstructing the essentialist secular exclusion of religion from politics to include religious conception of democracy in public discourse on popular governance. And on the other hand, reinterpreting Islamic Sharia to rearticulate religious signifiers toward a civil conception of Islamic state. Civil conception of Islamic states means a perception of democracy which can be built on an indirect subjectivity. Indirect subjectivity means God gives power to people and people give it to the officials. It is different from religious perception of Islamic state, which the clerics claim that God gives them power directly. So, someone maybe say that who cares about this difference? Because in theory, God gives the power, and it means the religious injunction are over the constitutional law. But in practice, it has very serious implications, because people's interpretations of religion can be the undermining, can be the basic structure, can be the basic rules which can restructure an Islamic state. So, at the end, I want to emphasize on my comparative scheme in a more strategic and practical way. In the long-standing democracies in West, populist challenge points to the necessity of reconstruction of democracy to a more inclusive conception of the people, the ordinary people. A new social imagination and progressive chain of equivalence might make such a revision and at the same time negate far-right populism or neo-fascism by leading people's multiple demand to a democratic announcement of it. I believe that the same as can be imagined regarding a typical Middle Eastern religion-affected society, that is, inclusion of Islamic democratic norms in the conceptualization of democracy might attract potential followers of radical Islamist, anti-democratic populist mobilization. For example, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, etc. So, Islamic fundamentalism is at the door and have potentiality to attract religious people if we leave them alone without offering any democratic alternative extracted from Islamic rule. So, at the conclusion, I want to sum up telegraphically what I have said. The populist challenge implies on the necessity of a more inclusive perception of popular governance in democracies, appropriated to the context, Western democracy or Islamic society. As an emotional discourse of constructing the collective subjectivity or people, populism has ambivalent implications, authoritarian or democratic, due to the host ideology. Overcoming the reactionary populism is predicated on the reformulation of accumulated demands in a progressive populism rather than condemning populism ethically. Affect-based reconceptualization of democracy might negate the radical populist mobilization in West and Middle East. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I personally enjoyed your presentation very much, and I was reminded of how, if you can call it the West or Western academia, public opinion, European public opinion and academia, join these pitfalls of perceiving and being more concerned about whether a certain elite in the Middle East is pro-Islamic or secular, and not really evaluating on the lies whether it's democratic or undemocratic. But people then don't teach Islam, are not acquainted with the fundamentals of Islam, don't know that Islam developed participatory and deliberative forms of behavior and public acting, like the Tawazun, Shura, Ijma, all these concepts way before Europe. And the Islamic world had Ibn Khaldun several centuries before we had John Locke. So it's very important to go back to those traditions which are deeply democratic and rooted in Islamic political thought. And thank you for reminding us how important this is. I really enjoyed it also from the perspective of populism and the consequences that populism leaves on societies. I do have a question about that, but I will leave the floor to the audience. So now we can collect 2 or 3 questions for the participants, and so please feel free to ask. It's the last chance on the conference. We are closing the conference after this, so please use the chance if you want to just state your name and who are you directing the question to, please. Don't feel shy. I know it's been a long day. I will post my question if you don't, so. Okay, until you come up with a question, I will ask Mohsen. Okay, so you spoke about the notion of the people and about populism, and I have the impression that in our experience, local experience, in the region especially, it has a twofold consequence. The first one is that usually the political right uses the people and the political left uses citizens, mostly. So you can see by this narrative differentiation who belongs where ideologically. And then, at some point, especially in my country, which is North Macedonia, the people became a signifier when we had an authoritarian right government of only that part of society that agrees with you. So basically you don't address the others because you have in parallel a discourse which I mentioned on the debate we had in Dorchelplatz. You utilize this traitors and patriots dichotomy. So basically the people are only the ones that agree with you. So you practically don't include, you exclude with this kind of signifier when you say the people. But can you tell us about the use of the people in your local context? How is it used? How is it perceived as a signifier? What does it signify? How do political leaders utilize, instrumentalize this word, this term? That's what I wanted to know. What are the dimensions of use of the people? Which is because it's one of the most flexible and, I would say, gummy phrases in political theory and in political practice as well. Who are the people in the Iranian context?
So, thank you for your question. It depends on your discourse. If you think the power is from emanating from the God without people's rule, you tend to, or you have tendency to religious perception of Islamic states, and it may lead you to an authoritarian perception of the relation between the officials and the people. And people here does not dignity except an instrument to, for example, give legitimacy to regime in manifestation, in government-led aggregations, and etc. But if you adopt another discourse about the dignity of people under Islam, you will have tendency to reformist attribution, reformist orientation about the political system, because you believe that people are who give the power to authorities, and no matter the nature of regime is religious or secular. People is important, and I want to emphasize a difference between people as instrument or people as subject, indirect subject who give power to the officials.
Thank you very much. I'm very satisfied with the answer. It reminds me of the John Locke's two treatises of government. This is exactly the debate between Robert Filmer and John Locke. This is exactly on point, that debate. So basically, thank you. Anna.
Okay, thank you very much. I also enjoyed all the presentation, except I already heard Sergio's, but I'm going to have a question for him as well. So for Sergio, when I first heard your presentation, I didn't really understand how important that was, because I wasn't part of any group, WhatsApp or any, and now I am, and then I can understand how it is important to analyze that. And what interests me is, what is your take on the fact that it is a very big difference whether you are part of a group or you're not part of a group. I don't know any other social situation where you can be so excluded as when you're excluded from a group, like you're not in there anymore and that's it. So just a comment on that, if you have, what have you thought about that? And for Biljana, also I would like to hear your comment. We talked about a lot this this opposition to politics, like how hated politics is and how nobody wants to be political. So did you think that that this is one part of the explanation why the duck was the representative, like why, you know, because everybody's, you know, trying to find something that is as far away from politics as possible, and the duck seems like far away enough. Thank you for now.
Okay, we got a question in the back. Let's collect the questions and then just do a block of answers.
Yeah, a question for Mohsen.
Just please say who you are.
Sorry? My name is Mladen Ostojic. And a question for Mohsen. I wonder how we can think about the relation between religion and democracy if we add the notion of modernity into the equation, which can be defined as a process of emancipation of the individual and the collective from religion. Now, this was a driving force in the democratization in the West, the emancipation from the emergence of secularism. Now, if we take into account this idea of democratic religion or democratic Islam, does that not involve any limitations to the emancipatory potential of this concept? Right. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Or we can skip to the answers, okay? By no particular order, but the way that they were posted, I guess. Yeah,
Start, yeah.
that would be fair, yeah. Sergio.
So many thanks for the question. Actually, I mean, I don't know if I have an answer, but for example, the last week we have some release updated by WhatsApp. So for example, the administrators of the group, they will be able to exclude the members of the group if something is not somewhere well negotiated. But for example, in the group that I still, I mean, a member of the group, there's also, we have a very good panel yesterday about activism scholarship. That's also the trouble should be part of the group and be recognized as a research, and all the troubles involve, I mean, the content that they share inside a private chat. But then what happens in my empirical case, that sometimes they have like huge discussions about something, and then some of the activists, they didn't agree with the final, I mean, decision, and then they leave the group. But then they do like a rescue operation, and they go there and put the activists again in the group, and then they restart the discussion, say what was the problem, let's try to, I mean, understand what didn't help so well that you leave the group. And then sometimes also, I mean, imagine in a situation with 121 activists in the same group, and they reply in the message at the same time. So sometimes it's difficult also to organize some, I mean, some activities, some protests, for example, in the same day, and they need to go to the streets. So then they organize like subgroups. So they put like 8 activists inside a subgroup, so they have like a decision-making process, and then they are back to the group to say, oh, we decide this, it's better to do like this, otherwise you cannot have like an orchestrated situation. But I mean, as you are in the private group, you can leave the group, so you have no control. That's why you always say that's fluid, the membership. No, even when you started, they reach the maximum, that's 256. And later on, we know about with the updates of the WhatsApp, will be 512. That's also, that's a problem also when you look at the misinformation, disinformation. But anyway, this is all, my answer would be like, it's fluid. I think that you have no control. You have the administrators that they control the gates on who can be part or who cannot. But of course, sometimes they have like huge discussions, and you can live in the group and be the group again. So the top of the group, for example, for 2022, it's of course the elections, and in some way the main, strategy is to collect votes against Bolsonaro. So now they are also discussing a communication strategy for the local neighborhoods, that in the city of Florianópolis, they have a lot of supporters of Bolsonaro, so they need to change some tactics. And then they are also creating new subgroups on the model group, and this is like an ongoing membership.
Okay, Liliana.
Thank you, Anna, for the question. Just to clarify, activists did not see the DAC as a representative. That's my conclusion, because the second part of the story didn't have time to tell. So this was the part about collective change and representative as a DAC here. It's a Laclau's representative. That's basically populist leader, you know, in her whole theory. I would say that you know, inadvertently, it became a DAC because on the other side you had Vučić. He is the omnipotent representative of everything, you know. So you don't have, you know, like to say that everything else is a fraud, including representative politics is a fraud. You need a DAC, regardless of whether you see this as a representative of your own ideas. The second part of my paper was about their own lack of words for what they do as representation. You know, they don't, I mean, people think representatives are elected, but at the same time, elected representatives, they criticize them as not doing representation, but they don't see that what they do is representation. So I think that we are stuck with words that are institutionalized, and we, as theorists, know meaning of these words, different conceptions and struggles within the theory as well, but also in political field. But vernacular language does not catch, you know, our ideas. And this is not something I've consistently thought about. I think I would need a history of ideas of representation in Serbian context. I think it's because we actually never had experience with representative democracy, a proper experience where actually you see a person that's your representative. So people see activists as the representatives, but would never use the word representatives, and representatives are not seen as representatives. And we have only one representative, so that's the president, that's Aleksandar Vučić. Even members of the parliament speaks of him as the only representative. And so to confront this, you actually need something completely different to confront the entire idea, and that is a DAC. But they would never say this, you know, in their ideas this was a symbol, you know, a visual identity, a humor, emotion that's also important for identification and creation of a constituency. And also one of my conclusions was that this actually worked much more than forensic work in compiling evidence, you know, analyzing tons of documents. Citizens care much more about, you know, visual humor than, you know, this forensic work.
Okay, Mohsen, please.
Thank you for your good question, my friend. I think the most important emancipatory effects of such a perception of democracy, I mean contextualized democracy, is keeping ordinary people immune or safe from being subjected to authoritarian religious injunctions led by clerics, because people are who can govern the society in the name of God, not clerics. This is important. I know that you may say ultimately God is over the society, but it is very important who interpret God's injunctions, people or cleric.
Okay, thank you. Are there any additional questions? Any raised points? Okay, if not, I would really like to thank our panelists, and we should give them a round of applause for, thank you all for enduring until the last day and the last panel of the conference, which was, for me at least, super interesting. And will you officially close the conference, or we just...
You can close.
Okay, I officially close the conference. Thank you for being here. It was an interesting 3 days and hope to see you again. For me, it was the first thing that happened live after COVID, so I was very cheerful. I hope that everybody shares that opinion and impression, and thank to our beautiful and very diligent hosts for organizing such an event.